On behalf of the Socialist Equality Party, I want to welcome all those in attendance at our Sydney venue and online. Our meeting, Free Julian Assange, Oppose Imperialist War, is one which we have called following the court case which was held on May the 20th, which our speakers will both refer to. Before I start, please, everybody in the venue, turn your phones off or down. Also to explain, my name is Cheryl Crisp. I'll be chairing today's event. We have two speakers. They will present their reports and we will then open for questions and discussion. In 1938, Leon Trotsky described imperialism, which was just before the outbreak of World War II, as the death agony of capitalism, one characterised by convulsions, crises, catastrophes, epidemics, and bestiality. That as the class antagonisms between the ruling elites and the working class grow ever more intense, he said all the, quote, elementary moral precepts disappear from the formulation of state policies. Mendacity, slander, bribery, venality, coercion, murder grow to unprecedented dimensions. And he then went on to say, without a socialist revolution, in the next period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. I quote these lines because one can only really understand the unrelenting pursuit and persecution of Julian Assange if it is placed in its objective context. The deepening crisis of capitalism expresses itself most sharply in war. And the opponents of war, therefore, are always the first target of capitalist governments and its state apparatuses. That is why, as the International Committee of the Fourth International from 2010 came to the defence of Assange and has launched a campaign in defence now of our own comrade, Bogdan Siratyuk, a Ukrainian Trotskyist and leader of the young guard of Bolshevik Leninists, who was arrested on April the 25th for his opposition to the war in Ukraine and for the fight for the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian working class. In fact, 2023 recorded more conflicts than at any time since World War II. The state of the world has been described as not a world war, but a world at war. I have to say that is not a permanent state of affairs, but one very much in flux. The increasingly strident demands for direct NATO-US involvement in the war in Ukraine, including the open calls for the use of nuclear weapons, pits two nuclear-armed countries, the United States and Russia, against each other. This unfolds as the Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people, notwithstanding the ICJ and ICC rulings, proceeds unabated. Nothing compares to the slaughter, the attempted annihilation of an entire population since that of the Nazis. And while there are conflicts and wars on the African continent, stoked and funded by different imperialist interests, the US, and with the Australian government in the lead, unrelentingly marches toward open warfare with China. The statement of not a world war could and will, if allowed, change to a world war and a world at war. The crimes of war Assange revealed, the backroom plans and discussions, the diplomatic cables and agreements, that is, the real voice of imperialism with teeth bared, that ordinary people aren't given privy to and they cannot be tolerated being revealed. So it must be suppressed. The old crimes can't be revealed because new and more terrible crimes are being organised. It is the reason that the IC has been at the forefront of the defence of Julian Assange since 2010. On December the 20th, 2010, the SEP in Australia held its first public meeting opposing the attacks being waged on Assange. It was titled "Imperialist Diplomacy Exposed: Behind the Witch Hunt of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange." We said in the course of that meeting that a whole slew of imperialist spokesmen and representatives had lined up to demand not just his jailing, but in the words of former Republican presidential nominee Mike Huckabee, that he be executed. The then Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, whose former advisor demanded that Assange be assassinated. Then US Vice President Joe Biden said Assange was, quote, closer to a high-tech terrorist than a representative of the media. Julia Gillard, then the Australian Labor Prime Minister, accused Assange falsely and knowingly falsely of carrying out illegal practices. And one should be reminded that when she uttered these words, she was the unelected and newly installed Prime Minister which had been carried out in a backroom coup against the elected Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with the help of US CIA assets in the Labor Party. While the personalities change, the attitude to Assange and to the opposition of war doesn't. Today, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says that what they are discussing, he referred to the atom bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a decision President Truman made not to end the war with Japan, because that had already really ended, but as a warning to the working class and to the Soviet Union that this is what the US will and can do, if necessary, to defeat any threat to it. Graham went on to say, "Give Israel the bombs they need to end the war that they can't afford to lose, and work with them to minimise casualties. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state, whatever you have to do. You have open calls by Israel to carry out the nuclear annihilation of Gaza." At our 2010 meeting, then National Secretary Nick Beams quoted Leon Trotsky, who said in November 1917, just following the Russian Revolution and the seizure of power for the first time by the working class in the overthrow of capitalism in Russia, Trotsky was referring to the fact that they were about to publish the secret diplomatic cables of the Tsarist regime and the imperialist powers. One must add that this declaration was met with utter fury by the imperialists of the day. In the statement of 1917, Trotsky wrote, quote, "Special diplomacy or secret diplomacy is a necessary tool for a propertied minority which is compelled to deceive the majority in order to subject it to its interests. Imperialism, with its dark plans of conquest and its robber alliances and deals, developed the system of secret diplomacy to the highest level. The struggle against imperialism, which is exhausting and destroying the peoples of Europe, is at the same time a struggle against capitalist diplomacy, which has cause enough to fear the light of day." Close quote. Assange and WikiLeaks has not been hounded and persecuted because they published falsehood and lies, but precisely the opposite, because they reveal the truth. The International Committee defends him because we defend the truth, because for the socialist movement, the truth is necessary to enable the working class to fight for its interests. Truth is knowledge, and with knowledge there is freedom to know what the real situation is, who the real enemy is, and what must be done to resolve it. The cause of war is capitalism. Its underlying contradictions that cannot be resolved by changing the personalities that populate the governments that represent it. While capitalism exists, there will be wars, more terrible and destructive than the last. The conditions, however, which create war, also create the conditions for capitalism's overthrow. And there is a power that can overthrow and defeat capitalism, the international working class. It can't do it by appeals to governments, but by its own independent mobilisation and organisation. It is to that end that the International Committee of the Fourth International and the SEP are committed. And it is to that purpose that our speakers today will address you. As I said, we have two speakers, and I'm sure both are well known to you. From Britain, Tom Scripps, the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP in the UK, and from here, Oscar Grenfell, a National Committee member of the SEP. Both comrades are distinguished by a vast array of articles they have contributed to the World Socialist website, but they are also noted as being comrades who have written extensively and have become leading voices in the fight to defend and free Julian Assange. That we have them both on the platform is a very great privilege. Comrade Tom, who will speak first, will be one of the SEP candidates in the upcoming election in the UK. I know it is now somewhat customary to describe bourgeois elections as crisis elections, but that label certainly applies to what has been described as a snap election in the UK. Either by accident or design, Rishi Sunak's soggy election announcement last week was somewhat symbolic of the state of his government. Comrade Tom will discuss this and more. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, both for that introduction and for those excellent opening remarks. And thank you to everyone in attendance for your participation this evening or today. Let me start this report by saying that I am sure I'm speaking to an audience of people very familiar with the course of the Assange case, the many steps in his persecution, the twists and turns of the legal arguments, up to this past Monday, when he was granted a right to appeal against the order for his extradition to the United States. I think Australia is perhaps the country with the highest level of awareness of Assange's situation and the significance of his case, in substantial part due to the activity of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. Given that assumed level of knowledge, and we can of course clarify any points in the question and answers if we need to, I wanted to begin by speaking about the legal case in overview. What are the key issues as they've been advanced by Assange's legal team and as they have emerged in the back and forth with lawyers for the US government? You would not know it from the, at best, slim and disinterested coverage in the corporate media. But the full extradition hearing that was held in September, October 2020 was an extraordinary legal and political event. I was observing and reporting proceedings for the World Socialist website, and I hope I'll be forgiven for citing myself in reading out some of the article that we published in an attempt to sum up the proceedings. We said, the 4 weeks of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's extradition hearing were a watershed in the collapse of democracy and the descent of world imperialism into abject criminality. 3 decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the unchecked explosion of US militarism, and 2 decades after the declaration of the War on Terror, not a single legal principle, democratic, or basic human right is left standing. While Assange sat in the dock, charged with espionage, the crimes he exposed were recounted by defense witnesses. Their phrases hung in the air of the courtroom, an indictment of the whole capitalist order. Collateral murder, the willful killing of unarmed and injured civilians. Extraordinary rendition, the illegal seizure of untried persons and their disappearances into CIA black sites. Enhanced interrogation, with torture delivered against hooded and chained subjects via beatings, sodomy, controlled drowning, and the use of coffin boxes. And wars of aggression, the crime, of course, for which the Nazi leaders were indicted at Nuremberg, leading in this case to the sociocide of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the deaths of up to 1 million people. Now, the judge in that court, as you will know, ruled against extradition, but on the sole legal ground that it would be oppressive by virtue of his mental health, in particular the risk of suicide. Every other reactionary legal argument advanced by the United States was accepted. As we explained at the time, this served 3 purposes. First, it provided the fig leaf of due legal consideration for the UK courts and government. Second, it left Assange's fate hanging by a single thread, which could be cut by US lawyers in the appeal process. And third, it narrowed the focus of that very long appeal process to the question of Assange's mental state, excluding the political issues, which are really at the heart of his case. Now that has, more than 3 years later, finally been partially reversed. The 2 grounds for Assange's appeal at the next hearing are centered on the denial of his right to free speech or freedom of publication as a journalist, protected under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. The lead US prosecutor has stated openly that Assange could be prevented from raising that protection, that fundamental legal right, in his defense at trial in the United States. And this argument was in fact explicitly endorsed and defended by the lawyers for the US government at Monday's hearing. As we wrote in our summary of those proceedings, here is US imperialism's case stripped bare, that it can use the Espionage Act to seize journalists it deems a threat to its national interests and try them without key legal and democratic protections. So what's at stake? We have moved, in other words, to at least some of the substantial issues in the case: the assault on press freedom, the denial of basic democratic rights. And the fact that it has been brought to this stage reflects, at least in part, the strength of the case that has been mounted by his lawyers, which has been, due must be given, excellent throughout. However, and this is the crucial point we'll be stressing today, we cannot view any step in the Assange case as a purely legal question and in isolation of its political context, which is ultimately decisive. Citing again from our report of Monday's hearing, We explained that the last time a decision went in Assange's favour against the grain of the case was the initial refusal of extradition on January 4th, 2021. At that time, the future of the US government was in turmoil, with Biden's replacement of Donald Trump challenged by an attempted coup and the storming of the Capitol building just 2 days later. Another political crisis, we said, is raging now. Biden is hemorrhaging support over his backing of the Gaza genocide ahead of another presidential election contest with Trump in November. There will be a faction of opinion in the White House happier to see a delay in proceedings against Assange rather than the rapid arrival of another potentially explosive political issue for the Democrats, as the WikiLeaks founder is dragged through the US courts. However, such considerations grant nothing more than a delay and a prolonged detention under intolerable conditions in Belmarsh. Nor are they a guarantee against sections of the US state as happy to trample publicly over Assange's democratic rights as they are the rights of the students protesting the slaughter of the Palestinians. All of which is to say that relying on the legal process alone to free Assange would be disastrous. If legal and democratic rights had been properly observed and acted upon by the courts, Assange would never have been imprisoned in the first place, either in Belmarsh or in the Ecuadorian embassy. The fact that he was is testimony to the essential function of the capitalist courts as instruments of the ruling class and of state policy. And it should be noted here that although the question of free speech is now formally back under discussion in the UK courts, the issues that remain excluded include threats against Assange's right to life, that is, the exposed plots for assassination, the clear political motivation behind his prosecution, and numerous, too many to list, violations of his rights to fair legal treatment. Why precisely this latest ruling has gone in Assange's favour, we can, of course, ultimately only speculate, but we can say two things for certain. Firstly, that there is, to put it mildly, no guarantee that the appeal hearing will find in his favour, however overwhelming the legal merit of his case. And secondly, that this next phase of legal proceedings provides a vital opportunity in terms of time and by foregrounding some of the key political issues involved in Assange's persecution to build a mass movement in his support. And it is to that task that his supporters in every country on the planet have now to turn their attentions and their most determined energies. I hope that it is already partially clear from what I've said that we are not speaking about a campaign of purely moral pressure aimed at bringing out President Biden's better nature. It is, of course, entirely correct, as Assange's supporters have done, to demand that Biden abandon the persecution of Julian Assange. But such an outcome can only be the result of an overwhelming popular movement, not the pricking of the president's conscience. Speaking outside the High Court on Monday, the former leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, told reporters, "My message to President Biden is this. You call yourself a Democrat. You walk in a tradition, some of which is a good tradition, of people that stood up. Those that stood up over Watergate, those that stood up against the Vietnam War, those that stood up for the civil rights movement. That tradition is, as he knows, alive and well in many parts of the USA. Join that tradition, drop the appeal, free Julian." Well, the first thing to say about that is that it's an account of Democratic Party history that will be unrecognizable to the exploited and the oppressed in the United States and around the world. It is in keeping with Jeremy Corbyn's career-long whitewash of the record of the Labour Party in the UK, but focusing for these purposes on the perspective that it advances for Assange's freedom. To call this naive would be overly generous, in reality, it is pulling the wool over the eyes of Assange's supporters about the struggle they really face. Biden, of course, leads an administration which has declared war on the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court for even investigating the charge of genocide in Gaza and seeking arrest warrants for Israeli leaders Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has pledged to work with far-right Republican members of Congress to sanction the International Criminal Court for its actions. And in the United States itself, the Democratic Party is carrying out an unprecedented, brutal crackdown on students peacefully protesting the Gaza genocide. There have now been, at last count, roughly 3,000 arrests carried out nationwide in a series of violent police raids, not to mention the expulsions, the cancelled graduations, and so on. And of course, here we've had the same response from Assange's jailers, the government of the United Kingdom. The persecution of Assange, in other words, is not some accident, as many among the official campaign tend to present it, a sort of unfortunate and inexplicable hangover of the Trump presidency. In fact, it is part and parcel of this same crackdown on democratic rights and opposition to imperialist crimes and war. In fact, as we have argued from the beginning, Assange was targeted to punish the exposure of past crimes in preparation for even bloodier crimes in the future, like those now being carried out by Israel. He is viewed with the same violent, murderous hatred as the, I think now 150 or so journalists and media workers now killed in Gaza. And it is, of course, not only Gaza. The imperialist powers are risking unimaginable destruction with their continued escalation of the NATO proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, whose population is being slaughtered on the sacrificial altar of the US drive for regime change in Moscow. Back in the Middle East, the imperialist powers are ready to leverage Israel's genocide into a regional war directed against Iran, itself, along with Russia, a stepping stone to the defining conflict of our era between US imperialism and China. We tried to make this point as clear as possible to readers of the World Socialist website when Assange originally took his appeal to the High Court this February. We published an article, a headline article, "The Fight to Free Assange is the Fight Against War." And in that article, we wrote that the case of Assange embodies the struggle against imperialist war, the authoritarian measures used to suppress anti-war sentiment, and the propaganda lies used to justify it all. He was targeted by Washington and London for publishing leaked documents detailing the crimes of the US government and its allies in Afghanistan and Iraq, and their conspiracies with dictatorships around the world. Assange sought to warn the population of the brutality the ruling class is capable of. Those warnings are now being daily and horrifically confirmed by the NATO-Russia war in Ukraine, where hundreds of thousands have likely lost their lives, and in the Israeli genocide in Gaza, already responsible at that time for at least 30,000 deaths, mainly women and children. Both are rooted in the drive by the imperialist powers for a new redivision of the globe, its people and its resources, which marks the ever deeper descent into a third world war. The persecution of Assange, which includes a CIA assassination plot and which has ravaged his health and stolen over a decade of his life already, has been the spearhead of a crackdown on opposition to war, in preparation for the eruption of military violence now underway. It was intended to set a chilling precedent that anyone who gets in the way of the war plans of the imperialist powers will be silenced and destroyed. Now, what this means for the campaign for Assange's freedom is that in acting to oppose his persecution, you are stepping into the titanic storm that is now blowing through world politics. You are coming up against fundamental class interests and imperialist objectives. And this point has to be made very sharply at this point in time, because we have had years now in which the policy of the official defense campaign has been to appeal to various figures in the establishment as the liberators of Assange, from presidents to prime ministers to politicians in various national parliaments, media organizations and NGOs. And the most criminal form that this perspective has taken has been the embrace and elevation of figures who, in an earlier period, contributed to Assange's persecution, either by maligning him or by remaining silent on his treatment. The likes of The Guardian and the New York Times, who published countless vile slanders, and of Jeremy Corbyn, who kept a complicit silence over Assange's plight throughout the entirety of 2 general elections he fought as Labour leader. Now, what all of these people and organizations have in common is a politics premised on imperialism's supposed capacity to see reason, and even its supposed concern for peace and legal rights. Their professed opposition to Assange's persecution, when it is not purely and cynically for the record, is circumscribed by a total opposition to any struggle which seriously threatens the interests and the stability of the imperialist states. And consequently, the years of leadership by the official campaign have been years in which Assange has been left at the mercy of his captors, his voice silenced, and his work through WikiLeaks cut short. We have argued from the beginning, and we repeat today, that Assange's real liberators are those with the sharpest interests in overturning the imperialist world order and defending democratic rights, and with the social power to do so, namely the international working class and youth. And today we are not at all pointing to a purely potential force, but a real movement which is underway. Millions have demonstrated all over the world against the crimes being carried out in Gaza with the complicity of their own governments. This is an event contributing to an epochal and profound radicalization of wide layers of workers and young people. And it is to that process that the Assange campaign must turn, by seeking to expand the anti-war movement, especially into the workplaces, and by explaining to its participants how vital it is that they inscribe Assange's name on their banners. As some of you may know, Comrade Cheryl referenced it, a snap general election was called in Britain this week. We now have ourselves an extremely short campaign period, barely more than a month, before the nation goes to the polls on July 4th. The Socialist Equality Party here will be fielding candidates, myself included, and we will be making the fight for the freedom of Assange a centerpiece of our campaign. British Prime Minister, pictured here, I think shortly before the downpour, himself trailered his party's election campaign by warning the world is closer to a dangerous nuclear escalation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, his words, and by indicting what he called an axis of authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And we wrote in our initial response to his announcement of the election, the fundamental issue facing the working class in this election is war and the offensive against social and democratic rights this demands. Assange is, of course, at the heart of those issues, and we will strive to make that plain. In particular, we will wage an offensive against the current leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, the overwhelming favourite to win this election, who played a direct and essential role in Assange's persecution as head of the Crown Prosecution Service during Assange's effective imprisonment in the Ecuadorian embassy under police siege. A final point before we hand over to Oscar, hopefully without treading on the toes of what he'll be saying. We have been, of course, holding events, meetings in person and online, rallies, protests, street campaigns, and so on, in Assange's support, of course, for years now. And we do hear from people, frequently hear from people who are with us all the way on this issue, who see its importance, who see its urgency, feel something must be done. That a feeling of paralysis that nothing can be done because we don't have the power to do so. Well, the answer is really very simple. It's that we need to create and organize that power. And we need to do so by the only means known to human history, which is the organized application of time and effort. If you are convinced by what you hear today, if you were convinced coming into the meeting even, now is the time to act, to make yourself available. Get in contact with the SEP and the World Socialist website where you are. Tell us, I want to do my bit for Assange, I want to be a part of the campaign, and we can discuss with you about how best you can contribute in collaboration with ourselves and with others. However the legal case now develops, more than 5 years in a maximum security prison, 12 years deprived of his liberty, is outrage enough to make freeing Julian Assange our urgent responsibility. And it is only made more so by the conditions of worsening war and escalating geopolitical conflict with which his persecution is inextricably intertwined. Thank you very much.
I think the points that Tom has raised are very pertinent. And he will remain online despite the fact that it was 5 o'clock in the morning when he had to join our meeting. But he will be available to answer questions, to have a discussion. I also want to take this opportunity to just note that we have online people attending the meeting from Brisbane, Newcastle, Townsville, Sydney, Adelaide, California, Melbourne, Blue Mountains, Port Kembla, New Zealand, Germany, Japan, Sri Lanka and Taiwan, which is fantastic. And obviously Britain. So our second and final speaker is Oscar Grenfell, and I know that you know him well. He is, as I said, a National Committee member of the SEP. He plays a leading role in the SEP youth movement, the IYSSE. He writes extensively on the World Socialist website on both international and national events and analysis. And I think, as you will agree, has become, with Comrade Tom, in the course of the campaign to defend Julian Assange, a go-to writer. The writers to which, if anyone wants to know what the situation is with Assange, how to assist in the campaign, these are the two comrades whose analysis, whose reporting, whose knowledge has made them those comrades who have educated, informed and provided a direction and perspective for this struggle. So I'm very pleased to introduce Comrade Oscar and ask you to give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Comrade Cheryl, and thanks to Tom for joining the meeting today and delivering that powerful report. Since the persecution of Julian Assange began in 2010, our movement has insisted that his defence is a crucial task of the working class. At stake is the liberty and the very life of a courageous journalist who's being hounded for exposing war crimes. But we've always explained that contained in the defence of Assange are far broader issues with a direct and immediate relevance to workers and young people. To put it bluntly, in defending Assange, we're defending all of our democratic rights against governments that are turning towards authoritarianism and dictatorship. Now, there's no question that there's a major element of retribution in the US-led frame-up and vendetta. The psychopaths in the Pentagon, the CIA, and the White House have never forgiven Assange for exposing their mass murders in Iraq and Afghanistan and for alerting millions of workers and young people to these horrors. The exact same thing can be said about the imperialist agencies and politicians in London and Canberra, as well as all of their mouthpieces in the corporate media. More than retribution, however, is involved in this. The onslaught against Assange, which has now spanned more than a decade and involved untold state resources, is the spearhead of a campaign to outlaw opposition to imperialist war. The US pursuit of Assange has unfolded alongside a continuous expansion of militarism and war. The relationship between the Assange case and this broader context of war and repression is now undeniable. Consider the context in which the latest stages of this monstrous political frame-up are proceeding. The US and all of the major powers are now engaged in what's developing into a new world war. In the Middle East, this involves the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, the most heinous war crimes of the past 80 years, and moves towards a direct conflict with Iran. Europe is in the midst of its worst armed conflict since the Second World War, and as we've emphasised, what's occurring in Ukraine is not simply an Eastern European regional development, it is a proxy war of the US and NATO directed against Russia. And in this region, the Indo-Pacific, there's a continuous drumbeat to war with China, involving a vast military build-up, the forging of war alliances, and ever more frequent military provocations. We've made the point that these conflicts are not disconnected episodes. They all stem from the breakdown of world capitalism, expressed in a developing economic slump, the ongoing COVID pandemic, and massive social inequality. And they're all manifestations of a very clear strategy. The US, the preeminent imperialist power in the world, is desperately seeking to offset its economic decline through the use of its military might. Pentagon documents over the past 5 years have openly stated that Russia, and above all China, are the targets, with the US openly declaring that great power competition has supplanted terrorism as the primary national security issue. As in the 1930s, this is an agenda that's completely incompatible with basic democratic rights, including freedom of speech and freedom of the press. This broader context of militarism and war explains why the strategists of American imperialism have decided that neutralising Assange, WikiLeaks, and anti-war journalism is a strategic imperative. One only needs to look at what's occurred over the past 7 months. Israel, armed with US bombs and backed by all the imperialist powers, including Australia, has massacred tens of thousands of Palestinians. The official death toll sits at around 35,000, but the truth is that no one knows how many Gazan victims there are because there's nobody left to count and so many remain trapped beneath the rubble. As long ago as February, the UN and aid agencies were reporting that 100,000 people in Gaza were dead, missing, or injured. Every single hospital and school in the Strip has been attacked by Israel at least once. Every university has been flattened. More than 140 journalists have been killed, more than in all conflicts of the past 40 years. 685 health workers have been murdered and another 900 wounded. You could say that these are the methods that Assange and WikiLeaks exposed in Iraq and Afghanistan, but now on steroids. These actions, while shocking millions of people, are legitimised or openly defended by all of the major governments and the official press. Whatever their nominal political orientation or ownership, all of the corporate media outlets, along with the ABC, have endlessly repeated that Israel has a so-called right to defend itself. Coverage of the actual atrocities that are occurring has been the exception, not the norm. To the extent that masses of people have seen the horrors in Gaza and been politically activated by them, it's been despite the media coverage, not because of it. Social media and independent outlets like our own, the WSWS, have broken through the propaganda blitz, which is precisely why there's now a stepped-up drive to online censorship, both here and internationally. I think there's no question that if Assange was at liberty and WikiLeaks was operating as it was in 2010, even more would have come out than has been exposed. That was highlighted last week by Israeli whistleblowers who lifted the lid on brutal conditions in an Israeli detention centre in the Negev desert. Near the Gaza border, there are 200 Palestinian detainees confined inside cages. Next to the cages is a field hospital where dozens of patients with war injuries are handcuffed to their beds and often deprived of pain relief. And here are the images leaked by the courageous whistleblowers. As many of you will have seen, last week, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor applied for an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defence Minister Gallant, accusing both of orchestrating the murder and extermination of the Palestinians. But the response to this, not only of the Israeli government, but of Biden, Albanese, and all of the imperialist leaders, is to denounce the ICC and line up with the war criminals. In this, they're openly junking the most basic precepts of international law established in the aftermath of the Holocaust. But the ruling elites are not only declaring war on the ICC, but even more strenuously on popular opposition. College students in the US, their counterparts in Europe and here, are being denounced as terrorist sympathisers and Nazis simply for protesting the genocide. The line is continuously put forward that any opposition to the war crimes is anti-Semitic in a fraudulent conflation of the Israeli state with the Jewish people. All over the world, in fact, Jewish people, especially Jewish youth, have played a central role in the protests and other mobilisations. But all of that is simply ignored. Protests have now been banned and broken up in Germany. In the US, we've seen massive police mobilisations against peaceful student encampments. And in Australia, similar measures have been threatened. We've emphasised that the scale of the war crimes that we're seeing in Gaza and the crackdown on popular opposition are not isolated phenomena related solely to the genocide. The onslaught on Gaza is not a unique event. It is the sharpest expression of a return to imperialist barbarism inextricably connected to the developing global war. And the crackdown on protests also has a broader aim. It's a bid to shut down the mass opposition that exists not only to the genocide, but to war more generally. Even among people horrified by the events in Gaza, we've found uncertainty and confusion about the events in Ukraine. That's not surprising. This has been presented by the entire media, as well as the Greens and fake left groups, such as Socialist Alternative, as the good war. The story goes that Ukraine is a plucky little nation fighting for its democracy and sovereignty against an unprovoked invasion by the madman Vladimir Putin. Now, this whole narrative is a fraud, and there are many ways in which it could be refuted. But the starkest, and one we're raising centrally, is the arrest of our Ukrainian comrade, Bogdan Suryatuk, last month. Just 25 years old and suffering from serious health problems, Comrade Bogdan is imprisoned in atrocious conditions in the city of Nikolaev. He's facing charges of undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine and serving the interests of Russia, which carry a prison term of 15 years to life. That is effectively a death sentence. But Bogdan has committed no crime. He's being framed up and persecuted for fighting to end the war and advance the interests of the working class, Ukrainian, Russian, and international. Bogdan is a leading member of the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists, the YGBL. It's a socialist organisation of youth throughout the former Soviet Union, opposed to all of the corrupt and reactionary governments in the region, and aligned with our world party, the International Committee of the Fourth International. The indictment of Bogdan, which we've written on, exposes his prosecution as a complete frame-up based on the same sort of big lie techniques that have been used against Assange. The SBU, that is the Ukrainian secret police, claim that Bogdan has functioned as an agent of the Putin regime. To prove that, they planted a backpack with the letter Z, a symbol associated with Russian military chauvinism, as well as a gas mask in the office from which Bogdan conducted his political work. That's crude and absurd. The office, which is photographed here, included a portrait of Leon Trotsky and other socialist material, which is diametrically opposed to the nationalism of the Russian government. That contradiction is glaring in the indictment against Bogdan. It states that the basis of the charge against him is that Bogdan has been for the past 2 years, and I quote, engaged in the preparation of publications commissioned by representatives of a Russian propaganda and information agency, the World Socialist website, end quote. The SBU's secret police further state that the WSWS, that is our publication, has been used to, quote, discredit the support of Ukraine by international partners, justify Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine, accusing Western countries of creating conditions under which Russia was forced to launch the so-called special military operation, fomenting wars in Ukraine by providing it with weapons, etc. As a result, they, that is the WSWS, are used by Russia to systematically convey pro-Kremlin narratives to the population of Ukraine and Ukraine's allied countries, end quote. But the indictment can cite no examples of a pro-Kremlin line. The SBU cites a statement issued by the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists in 2022. However, it leaves out all of the parts which denounce the Putin regime as the representative of a corrupt oligarchy based on the final betrayal of Stalinism, that is, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the indictment amidst the YGBL's condemnation of Putin's invasion as an adventurous and bankrupt response to NATO provocations. The SBU acknowledges that Bogdan, the YGBL, and the WSWS approach, quote, the main socio-political problems around the world from the position of revolutionary opposition to the capitalist market system with the aim of establishing world socialism through socialist revolution, end quote. But that admission exposes the contradiction at the very heart of the SBU case. The YGBL and Bogdan fight for a socialist perspective that is anathema to the pro-capitalist and nationalist program of the Putin regime. And they fight for that perspective not just in Ukraine, but in Russia itself, with the comrades there seeking to mobilise the working class against the invasion. This contradiction between acknowledging that Bogdan is a socialist internationalist and accusing him of aiding the capitalist government of Russia is characteristic of all frame-ups. Because they're a sham, they must include lies, as we know has been the case time and time again with Assange. This frame-up has immense political significance because it exposes the real character of the Ukraine war. The supposed democracy there is actually a fascistic police state serving the interests of the US and NATO. All of the major opposition parties in Ukraine were banned long ago. Men are literally being rounded up, whether they're scarcely out of boyhood or near retirement age, to serve as cannon fodder for an unending war, which has already claimed up to 500,000 Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russian lives. There's widespread and growing opposition within Ukraine to this war, which is precisely why Bogdan was arrested as part of a broader roundup of anti-war activists and government opponents. But the imperialist powers insist that the war must roll on and even escalate. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron this month declared that British munitions provided to Ukraine could be used to strike targets within Russian borders. That is, British bombs being used in a direct act of war on Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron said that NATO troops being directly deployed to Ukraine would have to be considered. He also said the following, I'll quote, "President Putin has constantly brandished the nuclear threat. Faced with such an adversary, it is such an act of weakness to give a priori limits on one's own actions. We must, on the contrary, deny him any idea of what we might do. This is how we can deter him from taking action." End quote. Now that's a very significant statement, because what Macron is saying is that nuclear war is on the table in Europe. The Russian government, he's indicating, must be made to think that the NATO powers will, or at least could use, their nuclear arsenal against Moscow. Far from a deterrence, as Macron claimed, this is like an arsonist pouring fuel on the fire. The major powers are being far more reckless than they were at any time during the Cold War. Even at its height, back channels between Washington and Moscow were maintained, and there was a recognition that miscalculations could trigger a disaster. Now, however, such a disaster is being openly courted. Now, there is a madness to this given what a nuclear war would entail, but it's not the madness of individuals. It's the madness of a capitalist system that's in breakdown, whose ruling elites have no solution to its insoluble contradictions except war against their rivals and an offensive against the working class. Any idea that Australia is exceptional or somehow distant from these developments would be a great mistake. In fact, under the current Labor government, it's very much front and centre. Labor has been as aggressive as any government in its support of Israel's atrocities, providing diplomatic, political and military support. Prime Minister Albanese has viciously attacked protesters as anti-Semites and purveyors of hatred and division who have no place in society. Australia is also involved in the proxy war against Russia, having provided more than $1 billion in aid to the Ukrainian regime, most of it in arms. Just days after our comrade Bogdan was arrested, Labor's Defence Minister Richard Marles was in Ukraine, hailing it as a great democracy, pledging drones and other offensive weaponry. Above all, Labor's focus has been on the militarisation of Australia to prepare for war with China. For the strategists of American imperialism, defeating Russia is viewed as a stepping stone to conflict with China, which they regard as the chief threat to US capitalist dominance. To that end, the entire north of Australia is being transformed into a war base, hosting major US strike capabilities, including B-52 bombers, which can carry nuclear weapons. The acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS agreement is just the tip of a much bigger build-up. Every branch of the Australian military is now being fitted out with strike missiles to ensure that it can carry out impactful projection throughout the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And as the government has stated repeatedly, this must be a whole-of-nation effort. That means subordinating every aspect of society to the war drive and suppressing opposition to it. It should be noted that that's also why Labor has refused to fight for Assange's freedom, continuing a complicity of Australian governments that's now spanned more than a decade. We know that this agenda of war and repression is and will encounter growing hostility. There's mass opposition to the genocide, to war, and to the enormous cost of living and social crisis. The same contradictions that lead to imperialist war do propel the working class into revolutionary struggle. That's the basis of a fight against the genocide, imperialist war, and for the freedom of Assange and Bogdan. But as Tom raised, it's critical that we draw certain lessons. Claims that protests based on moral appeals to governments can end the genocide, stop their warmongering, or free Assange have manifestly failed. This is the line that's pushed by pseudo-left groups who want to subordinate opposition to the very governments that are responsible for these crimes. Our perspective is the direct opposite. We're fighting for the independent mobilisation of the working class against all of the governments, which is the only viable strategy to free class war prisoners and to fight war. But above all, we explain that there is no easy solution to the problems that we confront. They're expressions of a huge and historic crisis which demands nothing less than the socialist transformation of society from top to bottom and on an international scale. That program is not a utopia. It's possible because it's necessary, but it has to be fought for. So that's why we appeal to all of you to join this movement and to take up the fight for socialism. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Oscar. I mean, I think both the contributions have provided an enormous wealth of information, analysis, and I'm sure there are questions that will be forthcoming. What I wanted to do first was to draw your attention to some of the publications that will be available and are available at the end of our meeting. The first one is The Logic of Zionism from Nationalist Myth to the Gaza Genocide. Now, this includes 3 lectures that Comrade David North, who is the chairman of the International Editorial Board and of the SEP in the United States, delivered in 2023 from the development of the war in Gaza. Obviously, there is an enormous amount of inquiry, interest, unclarity about Zionism, and these lectures, 3 different lectures in both October and November and December, provide a historical appraisal of Zionism, of what it is and its role. And I think that in so doing, it allows an understanding of certainly the myth which has been put forward that Zionism was and is an ideology for Jewish people, in the interests of Jewish people. It is not, it was not then, and it is not now. It is one of the nationalist mechanisms that are used to both pit and divide workers and set them against each other. And the socialist movement from the late 1800s, when Zionism first began to develop, has opposed this from the left, from the standpoint of the necessity of the unification of the working class on an international scale for a socialist perspective, because it is only socialism that can carry through and fight for the interests of workers on an international scale. That publication in its EPUB form is $9, in paperback, which is available here, is $18. The other publication that we have is Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st century. And again, is a compilation of a number of different articles. Now, these articles and lectures, speeches were delivered also by Comrade North, and they span 40 years. The significance in that sense of that fact is that there is a unity. Obviously, political conditions change in 40 years. But while there is a considerable period of time that separates the first 4 lectures and the last, they are united by the contemporary relevance of Trotsky and his analysis, despite a period of more than 7 decades since Trotsky fought. Because in that sense, as Comrade North goes through, all the same economic, political and social contradictions that existed in the 1920s and 30s also still exist now, while, of course, technological advances are profound, but nevertheless, the underlying contradictions of capitalism still exist. And so I think this publication, which is on the screen, is a profoundly important one, which brings together that analysis. It is $37, and it is also available today. If there are questions, please, any here, please let us know, and our speakers are more than happy to answer. Yep. Zach?
Thank you, Thomas, and Comrade Oscar, for those lectures. My question was, could you speak more on the stance of the pseudo-left towards Assange? From my understanding, they sort of abandoned him once allegations of a sex scandal were created.
Very good question, and a very important one. Yep, Peter?
Like, I understand the role of Jeremy Corbyn, but to me, far more pernicious and dangerous than Corbyn, and Corbyn for me is an enemy, but far more pernicious and dangerous is Galloway, right? And because Galloway, he has a lot of support. So I have many Facebook friends who support Julian Assange, but they also give their loyalty to Galloway, and Galloway has said some very powerful statements, but I know Galloway is, he's on the other side of the fence, right? But how do you prove that?
Okay, all right, good question. Okay, yep.
I'd like to just throw in, I mean, as an Assange supporter, someone campaigning with my friend Joe here for the freedom of Assange, the role of the MEAA, because my own experience is that they are very, let's put it this way, passive. They could have done so much. They could, for instance, answer phone calls, return phone calls. They could return emails. They could engage with the activist groups that there are to free Julian Assange. What a fantastic, creative and effective combination that would be. The union that was meant to be representing him and that he's a member of, actually combining with the groups that are on the streets, at least twice a week in different groups in Sydney, and we haven't seen them. They can't seem to catch a bus from Chalmers Street to Circular Quay or from Chalmers Street to Town Hall. What an effective combination. If they were actually interested, not doing this every week or twice a week, that would be far too strenuous for them, maybe once a month. Or once a year might be nice. But they can't even do that. They can't return a phone call. I've looked at their website on the way here, and there's a statement appealing directly to Biden to drop the charges. My just very simple-minded point of view would be that you you demand of Albanese. You wake up the workers. You wake up the journalists and members of the MEAA. and you make demands of Albanese, that he himself demands the release of Assange. I wrote to Noam Chomsky about this, and he said, look, the fight for, when he's retired a little bit, stepped back from public life, he's 95, but this battle to reclaim the MEAA is a battle worth fighting. I've approached journalists who are members of the MEAA, I know, and they're reluctant to do this. Maybe I'm personally not appealing in the right way or whatever it is, but whatever, even people I respect, they won't do this, and I think this is vital to be done. So where am I going wrong? Where have I got it wrong? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just so that everybody knows, particularly our international participants, the MEAA is the union covering media, journalists, and that area of that as our friend said, Julian Assange was a member of, and probably still is. Yeah. So these are actually excellent questions. The first one is on the role of the pseudo-lefts and why Assange was dropped after the sex scandal. The second, which obviously Comrade Tom could address, is the role of Galloway. And while Jeremy Corbyn deserves indictment, so does Galloway and his role, and how does one explain the role of Galloway? And the third, in terms of the role of the MEAA and their passivity and really non-fight for Julian Assange, and no attempt to demand of Albanese or of anybody else, for that matter, for Assange's release. So, Tom, did you want to answer the question of Galloway?
Some background as far as it's helpful. George Galloway has a long history in British politics, former Labour MP, was expelled from the party essentially over opposition to the Iraq War, has since run something of a one-man political operation which has unseated the Labour Party in several seats now since that time. He's a figure with something of a talent for latching on to the political mood. He's recently elected the Member of Parliament for Rochdale in a by-election, which he ran as a referendum essentially on the question of Gaza. He ran in opposition to the policy of the Conservative government and also the complicity of the Labour Party, and won a landslide vote for which he was denounced the next day as a threat to democracy by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. What has to be, there are particularities to that constituency which enabled that vote or made that vote more likely. Nonetheless, of course, he tapped into broad popular opposition to the Gaza genocide. The key with Galloway, as you've indicated, there are many aspects of his politics which are quite openly reactionary. Despite their being presented with a left gloss, in particular, a quite overt nationalism. If one has to characterize his politics today, it is a sort of nationalist populism. He runs his Workers' Party of Britain, which is his outfit now, which, as you indicate, has grown off the back of his Rochdale success, although one shouldn't underestimate the degree to which this is the Galloway party. That party is running a campaign which includes opposition to migration to the country, a sort of championing of law and order and the police, a a very conservative attitude to very social issues. As far as the and I should say a deep hostility, in particular to Trotskyism, in general to socialist internationalism. He doesn't miss an opportunity to throw punches that way. Keeping it focused on Assange, I mean, as far as one has to, which is an issue he has taken up. Assange is a figure he has defended. The point that has to be made is about the nature of Galloway's opposition to imperialism, which is in reality a sort of anti-Americanism and not an opposition to the imperialist world system or really a serious international anti-war position. Galloway is an advocate of what's sort of broadly referred to as the politics of multipolarity, the idea that American imperialism will be successfully restrained, penned in, tamed by rising powers, notably, or most commonly advanced, the ones Galloway would advance, Russia, but in particular China. These are seen as these governments and states are seen as an effective counterweight to US imperialism. In Galloway's case, that involves a whitewashing of the nature of these regimes. I mean, he'll phrase it frequently as well, you know, you and I don't have to like them, that's just the way it is, and these are the powers that offer a counterweight to US imperialism. The most, which is dangerous in itself, but the most dangerous thing, of course, is the suggestion, the false suggestion, that the waning power of US imperialism in the world, which is a reality, which is a real process, will result in anything other than an explosion of militarism on its part to try and regain its position, which we are now seeing. The job of acting against that cannot be outsourced to the Russian oligarchy, Chinese oligarchy. It has to be the task of the international working class of America, Russia, China, and everywhere else. And Galloway's politics is defined by for all that he sort of makes a pitch as a sort of workers' candidate and his party is the Workers' Party of Britain, a deep skepticism and cynicism towards the fighting capacity of the working class, particularly as an international force. I mean, Galloway sees the nation state and the nation as the sort of only really viable political unit and political force. He backed Brexit on this basis, and he was prepared to align himself with Nigel Farage, far-right figure in Britain, to that end, uttering the infamous words, left, right, politically, forward march to victory. He was prepared to share a platform with Trump's fascistic former advisor, Steve Bannon, to that end as well. So you're very right to point to the dangerous and reactionary nature of his politics. The argument has to be as far as opposing or critiquing the sort of defense of Assange that he would advocate has to be rooted in that critique of his position on imperialism and on the necessary opposition to it. It should also be pointed out his political opportunism, extreme political opportunism. You mentioned, of course, you mentioned Corbyn and then Galloway. Galloway, when he was elected as MP for Rochdale, his first act was to seek essentially a political alliance with Corbyn and the Labour left, which Corbyn rebuffed, of course. Galloway does make and this is a successful pitch, funnily enough, in Britain, political capital out of attacking the Labour Party in a way that few on among the pseudo-left certainly are prepared to do. But he does not offer a politics of serious opposition and principled opposition to Labourism in a broad sense, and would very happily join forces with the likes of Corbyn and so on, who have remained loyal members of a party which has played a key role in the persecution of Assange. So it's a complicated question. It's one that we expect to come up and to have to fight out in the course of the election in Britain. But that's where I would turn, as far as you confront it yourself, to Galloway's, to the specific nature of Galloway's anti-imperialism, problems with it, the nature of the anti-war opposition, how he sees geopolitics, cynicism towards the working class, and so on. Hopefully that begins to get at some of the answers to that question.
Thanks, Tom. And look, obviously, Comrade Oscar will comment on some of these questions as well. We have 3 more questions. Now, we do hope to try and answer them all. One is, can we comment on the David McBride case? Again, for our international audience, David McBride was an ex-army lawyer, whistleblower, who provided information to journalists on the war crimes in Afghanistan. As it turns out, McBride is, to date, the only person who has been prosecuted and now jailed for 6 years for the war crimes in Afghanistan. Not that he carried them out, but that he informed people that in fact they had happened. Nobody else has. Not the leaders, not the commanders, nobody, none of them. Anyway, so that's who David McBride is, and if there's any comments on that. Another question from Will. While Assange has been given the right to appeal, how has his legal appeal been narrowed? Secondly, there has been collusion between the US and Britain throughout. The US didn't seem as determined as last time to ensure that Assange be immediately extradited. Do you have any idea of why this is so? And then the last question, could we speak on the perspective of the multipolar world that is being welcomed by many anti-imperialist commentators? So there's still a couple of questions from before, which Oscar will answer. Comrade Tom and others, if anybody else wants to answer too, please let me know.
I'll just make a couple of points on the Swedish allegations and the role of the pseudo-left, because they are a central component of the frame-up and persecution of Assange over the past 14, 15 years. What we're referring to are allegations of sexual misconduct levelled against Assange in late 2010 in Sweden. Without going through all the details, I mean, it's very clear that this was a fabricated case. There was no factual foundation to it whatsoever. The Swedish allegations and police investigation were riddled with inconsistencies that included the fabrication of physical evidence, police collusion, and the like. And I think, it's important to remember the timing of this. In late 2010, Assange was exposing these massive war crimes of the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, beginning to publish the diplomatic cables exposing US meddling all over the world. And then out of nowhere, you have these very murky and Swedish allegations which were latched on to attack him. There's no question whatsoever that US and British agencies were involved in this. It was part of their offensive against Assange because he'd exposed their war crimes. They couldn't say, you know, you've exposed the mass killing of civilians, so we're going to attack you. They had to smear him, frame him up. But as Zach, the questioner, indicated, it was not just the governments. I mean, there was a whole milieu of the upper middle class which joined this campaign against Assange, ignored the fraudulent character of the Swedish investigation, and that included the pseudo-left. In Britain, parties such as the Socialist Workers' Party, and here, Socialist Alternative also joined the campaign. They've tried to bury that. I'll just quote from what Socialist Alternative wrote in August 2012. They said, Assange is wanted in Sweden for questioning over rape allegations. Those allegations should not be dismissed, as some of Assange's defenders have done out of hand. He should face questioning and be held to account if it transpires that he committed such an offence. Now, that's no defence of him whatsoever. That's an attack against him and a joining of, you know, a witch hunt, a frame-up. As it transpired, I mean, the Swedish investigation never passed beyond the preliminary stage. Assange was charged with no offence whatsoever, and the entire matter has now been dropped. But I think this is the response of the pseudo-left was very revealing, because it shows that these are not socialist or left-wing organisations. They're not organisations of the working class, but of a privileged layer of the upper middle class, which seeks to advance its own interests within the framework of capitalism, including through the use of identity politics based on gender, race, sexual orientation. And it should also be noted that these are pro-imperialist organisations. I mean, we've been discussing the US-NATO war against Russia and Ukraine today. That's supported by the bulk of the pseudo-left internationally. Socialist Alternative, who I just cited attacking Assange in 2012, have explicitly said that Western weapons should be sent to Ukraine so that it can defend itself. So these are pro-war and pro-imperialist organisations. Just on the MEAA, I mean, I think it's correct that, you know, to call their support for Assange token would risk overstating it. I mean, they've written a handful of pro forma statements over the past 5 years. They haven't mobilised a single individual or spent $1 on the fight for Assange's freedom. And it's not an accident. I mean, it's the character of the MEAA, but of all of the trade unions. I mean, these are corporatised entities, politically aligned with the Labor government. And you can say, I mean, the unions have done nothing to defend Assange, but they've done nothing to oppose the genocide in Gaza, to oppose war. In fact, they've done the opposite. They've sought to prevent any industrial and political action by workers because they're, you know, as I said, essentially a party of affiliated with the Labor Party and its whole program of war. So what we're raising, and I think, you know, Tom emphasised this in his remarks, is that we need to take matters into our own hands. I mean, we need to build independent rank and file committees controlled by workers, not by trade union bureaucrats. You need a network of such committees throughout workplaces which can prepare the action that's required to fight for Assange's freedom. But the experiences have shown that appeals to the MEAA leadership are essentially futile. So I'll just make those points.
Just to add to the points that Comrade Oscar raised about the MEAA and the fact that token, yes, one could actually, I think, more appropriately characterise it as abandonment, and the role that the MEAA has played in terms of the defence of Julian Assange. And I know one thing which one could ask the question. I mean, we are now in a period of war. Thousands of young people, of workers, are protesting throughout the world in opposition to the genocide in Gaza. They are being arrested, thousands arrested in the United States. If those young people had to rely on the unions to secure their freedom, then they would be in dire trouble. And that's the same in terms of Assange. And the way that the MEAA, all the unions have responded to the situation confronting Julian Assange is quite frankly no different to the way they deal with their own members. I mean, these are unions who purportedly exist to represent the interests of their members. They have overseen, not only have they sat by and allowed, but they have overseen the attack on conditions and wage levels of workers here in the United States, internationally. In fact, increasingly now, the Biden administration, the Albanese here, relies on the role of the unions to suppress the struggle of workers in every sphere. In terms of the defence of Julian Assange, I mean, the issue of David McBride, not one union raised the point that this whistleblower who had revealed the crimes which the Australian Army, the Australian Defence Forces have carried out in Afghanistan, is the only person who is now sitting for 6 years in a jail. Not one word from the unions about this situation. I mean, in that sense, and there was a very sharp experience last Monday in terms of the Victorian nurses, just to give a sense of it. There was, and I'm sure the union leaders will have recognised their folly in organising a mass meeting of nurses who, let's remind ourselves, only a few years ago, everybody had to get up and clap. You know, these were the heroes of the pandemic. Now, you know, they are fighting for better working conditions. I mean, such is the conditions which face nurses now, not just in Victoria, but nationally and internationally. Such is the exodus that has been undertaken in hospitals because of the huge workload that they now cannot carry out their job properly. In Victoria, the unions imposed an 8-year wage freeze on nurses. They have now begun to negotiate the EBA. They organised a mass meeting on last Monday, of 3,000 nurses. The union leaders walked in. There was something of a festive, you know, because the union leaders had put forward that they would agree with strike action, which they won't. But in the 48-page PowerPoint presentation, which was presented to them, which was designed to cover over the fact that not only was there not a wage rise that was going to make up for 8 years of a wage freeze, but in fact was going to end up being a wage cut. There was this furor erupted, and the EBA was overturned, was voted down. The union leaders are now organising to ensure that that vote is overturned, that, you know, they're going to hospitals, trying to separate, isolate workers. What is happening to the Victorian nurses is no different to what's happened with workers internationally, because what governments are doing is spending their budgets on tax cuts for the rich, defence spending, war, and that has to come from somewhere. And it comes from the working class. And the role of the unions now is not, as it was, to beg for crumbs from the table of the ruling class, but is now to impose the requirements of the ruling class onto the working class. And so they're not, and any conception that the unions will defend either the democratic rights or the economic and social rights of the working class is something which is a profound error. And so I think that the relationship between their attitude to Assange or to McBride or to war is very much the same as the attitude to the working class. Comrade Mike Head can speak more on David McBride, but if Tom, or maybe Mike could speak and then Tom could answer Will's question on the issue of why the US has agreed that, at least at the moment, Assange won't be immediately extradited.
A couple of points about the McBride case. It's an important question. I think the first point to make is that the way the Labor government has pursued the prosecution and now the jailing of McBride exposes totally any pretense it has of coming to the defence of Julian Assange. This is a legal proceeding that the Labor government entirely controls. The Attorney General has the power under the Judiciary Act to intervene to halt the prosecution. The Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, acting on behalf of the Labor government, has refused to do so. Not only that, but in the course of the prosecution, this government, the Labor government, insisted that McBride could not argue any public interest defence. They said that his attempt to invoke the Nuremberg principle, that is, that he had a higher duty than to follow illegal orders. This was the defence that was raised by the Nazis after World War II, which was rejected by the Nuremberg Tribunal. The Labor government's lawyers insisted that defence could not be raised, and the courts ruled accordingly. So this Labor government has taken centre stage in ensuring that, as Cheryl said before, the only person prosecuted and imprisoned for the now well-documented war crimes conducted by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan, the only person is the one who laid bare the evidence which led to ultimately an ABC television series on the Afghan files and forced in the end an official inquiry. That official inquiry confirmed that there was credible evidence of at least 39 murders of Afghan prisoners and civilians by Australian forces. And yet that inquiry at the same time said this was just the responsibility of the foot soldiers directly involved, not of their commanders and not of the governments which sent them into that neo-colonial war as part of, and as a matter of fact, all the war crimes occurred during the Obama administration and the Gillard government in Australia, pretty much all of them. That was during the surge of Obama, supported by the Gillard Labor government. Of course, that was another aspect, of the increasing turn to militarism by US imperialism and its allies to seek to assert global hegemony. So the Labor government, just to come back to the central point here, is that the Labor government has complete capacity to end the prosecution of McBride, but has done the opposite of that. And that shows that all their pretenses that they can't, that the Assange prosecution is out of their control and therefore they can't intervene is a complete lie. Just one other point about the punishment of McBride, and this is a parallel to Assange as well. In sentencing McBride to nearly 6 years in jail, the judge, Mossop, said, look, what McBride did itself, I'm just paraphrasing here, is he called mid-range. And in fact, the only evidence, you couldn't even say that the evidence he produced was of any military secrets per se, but it was of the war crimes. But Mossop said, we have to impose a severe sentence because of the general deterrent effect which is necessary, particularly as it can apply in periods of war. And he made the point that the Defence Act, under which McBride was sentenced, provides for unlimited imprisonment. In other words, the crimes for which McBride was convicted there's no limit to how long you can be jailed for those crimes. This is a particular provision of the Defence Act, which goes back to World War I. I'm just making this point because it does show you again how the preparations for war are proceeding and in fact intensifying under this Labor government. So hopefully that clarifies and it shows again how much is at stake in the defence of Julian Assange and all those who've sought to speak out against the drive to war, including, of course, Comrade Bogdan in Ukraine.
Thanks, Mike. That was helpful. Comrade Tom will briefly answer the last two questions, but while he's preparing, I would like to make an appeal at this point to our monthly fund. We have a $25,000 monthly fund that we raise every month. We have been raising our monthly fund for now over 50 years, and it is that source of resources, of funds, that allows our movement to develop, to carry through its work, and to expand, and in particular, the capacity to write on the World Socialist website. We get no funds from the state. We get no funds from electoral funds. We get nothing from corporate sponsorship. The only area is our members, our supporters, and the working class. And so I would very much appeal to you here online for the most generous, if possible, monthly fund and donations today. Tom could just answer briefly the last two questions. Thank you.
Okay. So the first question was towards the scope now of the appeal and also a suggestion that the United States is perhaps more nervous about proceeding at this stage than it had been. Yes, the scope of the case remains substantially narrower than it should be. When Assange's legal team put in its application for an appeal in February, I believe there were 10 legal grounds that they advanced, really only 2 of which have survived. What has been essentially excised, the appeal hearing will not consider, are points relating to Assange's prosecution for his political opinions. That is an act which is barred in the treaty which governs extradition, which is barred in the UK's extradition act. His lawyers advanced arguments under Article 7 of the European Convention. That is no punishment without law, which points to the fact that the US has concocted a novel series of novel legal arguments after the fact, after the acts carried out by Assange in order to entrap and imprison him. Also, there were grounds advanced under Article 6 of the European Convention, that's the right to a fair trial, pointing to the numerous ways in which a trial in the United States would be stacked against him, from the composition of the jury to the conditions of pretrial detention, which would seriously make impossible preparing a legal defense. He wouldn't be allowed access to key documents, would have trouble seeing his lawyers, all of this. And then critically as well, grounds under Articles 2 and 3 of the European Convention, the right to life and the right to freedom from full and unusual punishment, which relate to the fact that Assange was the subject of an assassination plot by members of a section of the Central Intelligence Agency under the direction of the US President and the government, the state, now claiming to seek Assange in a purely legal way. Those will be excised. So that remains, that is added to the list of legal travesties in this case. As far as, well, we're answering the question, why is this one of only the second time really that a ruling has gone in some way in Assange's favour when every other one has gone the other way. I think that has to be seen in the context of the political crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. British politics is in a state of freefall. The government is despised, and so is the opposition. I think there was certainly, we can only speculate, but there must have been a feeling that to just ship Assange to the United States without the additional fig leaf of having given it due consideration and putting it through the highest possible court will have played a factor. And it's a similar concern, as I indicated, in America, where the dragging of Assange through a kangaroo court for exposing war crimes under conditions in which the Democratic Party is waging a politically costly war against the student movement, but more broadly in America, against those protesting contemporary war crimes, was certainly a prospect that was not amenable to sections of the administration. Now, one wants to make sure in saying this that you don't sow any complacency whatsoever. Doesn't mean they're not going to do it. I pointed in my remarks to the open crackdown on student protesters and in the United States. But it is important to make this point because it indicates the other and the key social factor in these proceedings, which are not all just the purely the playthings of Assange's persecutors of the ruling class in Britain and the United States. Another key factor, which is yet to fully have its say, is the working class and is the mass movement which can be built in Assange's defence, and which the ruling class are very aware of. They act with that terrifying to them prospect clearly in mind, and we should take heart from that. We should see in the working class and young people and in the anti-war movement as much potential, and in fact more, than the ruling class sees in it in a fearful way. That gets somewhat towards the point on multipolarity. The question was about referred to it as the neo-Kautskian perspective of the multipolar world. Kautsky was a theoretician of the Second International, end of the 19th century, start of the 20th, who developed a theory of what he called it at the time ultra-imperialism, that the growing interconnection of world economy and so on, and world politics, would make it economically foolish for any of the major powers to go to war with each other. There was no money in it. There was too much money to be made from free and easy trade. Why would they go to war? Not much really needs to be said in argument against that, other than to point to the history of the 20th century. Kautsky ultimately capitulated to German imperialism in the course of the First World War, advised abstaining on the vote for war credits to the army, argued that Germany was the German war effort was a defensive one against Russian barbarism, and so on. And there are very close parallels with what's now being advanced with multipolarity. to the idea of ultra-imperialism. The sort of suggestion that the sort of simple playing out of objective forces in world economy and geopolitics will create a sort of balancing act, will carry out a sort of balancing whereby US hegemony will be restrained, and that will remove the source of war and conflict in the world. And there's an element of sort of mutually assured destruction as a justification for that as well. Increasingly, again, this is not an argument that has to be fought on the theoretical plane. It can be made by pointing to real developments. This is not how things are playing out in the war that is being waged via Ukrainian proxies, but increasingly directly between NATO and Russia. The United States is in fact responding to its declining world position by seeking to use its immense military strength to dominate its rivals, to try and secure its position in the world through a capture of wider markets, more of the world's resources and materials. And that's very much what's at stake in Russia, which it hopes to gain access to, but in essence, through collapsing the state and making it more politically and economically exploitable. And it has the same objectives with regard to China. And it is prepared, and this is the crucial point, it is prepared to engage in a game of military escalation and what we've called sort of nuclear Russian roulette. Nuclear weapons are now regularly discussed in the bourgeois media and among governments as a viable aspect of a war that is increasingly referred to as inevitable between NATO and Russia at this stage. But as we say, it goes broader than that. Now, in that light, the suggestion that the Russian state and government and the Chinese state and government, we can look to them and to their strength and rise, which is a ridiculous statement as far as Russia, so in China, but nonetheless, as a counterweight, as our saviors from war, from the risk of war, and so on, is sort of shown for the ludicrous suggestion that it is. It's more than ludicrous because it diverts attention away from the urgent and necessary fight to build an anti-war movement, not composed of a sort of carefully arranged states and their interests, but of the social force that actually has an interest in ending war for good, and which, as I said in my remarks, has the power to do so, is the international working class, which can only fight on the basis of total opposition to all the ruling classes in the world. Of course, the imperialist powers, but also just as much for the workers in Russia against the Russian oligarchy. And as far as an attempt to tie this together, that is a program which is bravely and principally upheld by Comrade Bogdan, his comrades in Ukraine, Russia, and throughout the territories of the former Soviet Union, and that is why his defense by everyone here is so critical. He is a shining example of the anti-war struggle that has to be urgently waged in our time in history. So as far as these are my closing remarks, really encourage people as well as the Assange campaign, and as part of it, to participate as fully as you can in the fight for the freedom of Comrade Bogdan as well.
Thank you very much, Tom. And just leading on from Tom's last comments, the campaign for the release of Comrade Bogdan, which, as Oscar and Tom have highlighted, is urgent, just as the release of Assange is. The lies, the falsifications, which have been part of the basis of the indictment against Bogdan, are designed as, and I think as Mike went through, this is an attempt under conditions of a huge level of opposition which exists within Ukraine. 500,000 Ukrainian young men have died. 500,000. Zelensky is now demanding that those who left Ukraine are forced back to become part of a new lot of 500,000 that he is going to throw into the grinding machine of that war. This, the fact that Comrade Bogdan has been arrested is because he represents the most conscious, the most politically developed opposition, one that not just opposes war, but provides a perspective for which Ukrainian, Russian, and of course, European and all sections of the working class can fight. We are responsible, as we are in the fight for the defence of Julian Assange, to undertake the most profound struggle for his release. We have petitions which, as you can see here, there's a QR code to sign, to put statements in the petition. We also are calling for statements from everybody here, from political organisations. I mean, our turn is to the working class, but we are requesting, we are requiring that political parties, irrespective of whether they agree with us on overall political issues, but Bogdan is a socialist who has been jailed because he is a socialist opponent of war. And the working class internationally is responsible for mobilising for his release. So we would like people to make statements, to sign the petition, and to campaign, to distribute our statements as broadly as possible to fight for his release. Yes, I have. I mean, the question that Peter is asking is, has he been spoken to? Yes, he has. Look, that I don't know. Yeah. I mean, we're certainly fighting for him to get legal representation, but of course, lawyers in Ukraine also have no rights. If a lawyer is identified as being an opponent of the Zelensky regime and the war, they are sent off to the front. They are victimised as much as possible, and so there is a profound responsibility that the international working class and of course our movement, which is fighting to secure his freedom. Finally, and I know there's been a lot, in fact, our very close supporter, Mags, has written, what an amazing meeting Assange has been linked and talked about today with Bogdan, McBride, Galloway, unions, Palestine, nurses, also very linked and yet not usually discussed in the same conversations. Excellent. And it's a very important point. It is, because they are all connected. And can only be understood through their interconnectedness. Finally, I want to appeal to everybody here who is not an electoral member of our movement to sign up as an electoral member. This is part of the fight to re-register the SEP, which will enable our candidates in a federal election campaign to have then the name of our party, the SEP, on the ballot paper, through the completely anti-democratic measures which the Morrison, and of course upheld by the Albanese government, has undertaken, that is not required of parties that have parliamentary representation, is that our membership, our electoral membership, has to be has to be scrutinised by the AEC, checked, which is the Australian Electoral Commission, in order that we can have what is a basic democratic right, and that is to stand in elections and to have our party on the ballot paper. This is certainly an anti-democratic measure that was carried out against all small parties because of the fear which exists by Labor and the Liberals in particular, that such is the opposition and hatred towards these political parties that nobody will vote for them. And so to ensure that they don't know who to vote for, our registration was cancelled because the requirements were trebled from 500 members to now 1,500 members. We are in the process of winning those 1,500 members, and we have received a profoundly important response, but we've still got to get the whole 1,500. So I urge you to become an electoral member, and as part of that, to consider seriously becoming a full member of the SEP, to take your role, take your place in the fight for the development of the overthrow of capitalism and the political organisation which is necessary to carry that through. And that is the development of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the international movement of World Socialist Revolution as the only means to avert war, as the only means to ensure that mankind not only is able to survive, but can go forward as part of what is then the real history of mankind. On that, I thank you for your attendance, for your questions and contributions, and in particular to thank Comrade Tom from Britain and Comrade Oscar for their excellent reports, which have been the basis for this discussion. Thank you very much.